Welcome to the case of the Port Blair Vanishing, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, The Eastern Enigma. Tales from the Great Hiatus, playing in the year 1892. For years after Reichenbach, the world believed my friend lost. It was only lately, within a hidden compartment of his old travel trunk, that I found his secret journals. Penned in a cipher of his own devising, they reveal his true activities during the Great Hiatus, a perilous journey through the East, where the master of Western logic confronted the ancient mysteries of the Orient. I shall begin with the first of these strange narratives, an adventure Holmes titled The Case of the Port Blair Vanishing. Chapter 1. Even now, the memory of our arrival at Port Blair conjures the sensation of a damp, woolen blanket pressed against my face. The heat was a physical presence, a suffocating force, drawing the very strength from one's limbs. A world away from the familiar fogs of Baker Street, the air hung thick with the scent of salt and decaying vegetation, carrying the ceaseless hum of a million unseen insects and the mournful cry of gulls. I would have found the place utterly miserable had I not been with the one man in the world who seemed entirely impervious to his surroundings. A most fascinating ecosystem, Watson. Observe the tenacity of that mangrove root. It thrives not in spite of the brine, but because of it. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He spoke with the dry, academic enthusiasm he reserved for his peculiar passions. To the world, he was the celebrated naturalist Sigerson, arrived in this remote corner of the empire to catalogue a rare species of orchid. To me, of course, he was Sherlock Holmes, seeking respite from the London underworld in a puzzle of petals and stems. Ahead of us, beyond the squalid little town, rose our destination, the cellular jail. A monstrous thing of reddish-brown brick. Its 7 wings radiated from a central tower, like the arms of some hideous sea creature cast ashore. Its very sight seemed to quell the jungle's noise, leaving only the rhythmic crash of the surf and the distant metallic clang of a hammer on iron. A man stood waiting for us at the formidable gate, his white uniform immaculate despite the oppressive humidity. He was lean and weathered, with a tightly trimmed moustache and eyes that held a permanent haunted watchfulness. This was Warden Croft, the man who commanded this grim establishment. Mr. Sigerson, I am Croft. I must confess, your request is a most unusual one. We are not accustomed to visitors, particularly not those in pursuit of botany, Warden Croft said. His voice was clipped and devoid of warmth, the voice of a man long used to issuing commands and expecting unquestioning obedience. And I am most grateful for the accommodation, Warden. The Dendrophylax andamanensis is said to grow only upon the oldest, most undisturbed structures. Your prison, if I may say so, is a masterpiece of layered history, Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes gestured with his cane towards the walls. I could see nothing but oppressive brick, but he, it seemed, saw a great deal more. The original 19th century masonry is quite distinct from the later repairs. And that north wing, the brickwork suggests it was a later addition, perhaps from the turn of the century, incorporating a section of some much older fortification. A fascinating architectural palimpsest. Governor Crewe must be a man of considerable historical appreciation to preside over such a place. At the mention of the governor's name, Croft's posture tightened subtly. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound. Governor Crewe appreciates one thing above all, sir: absolute security. He has made this prison what it is today, inescapable. Entire sections have been sealed for decades. He tolerates no weakness, no deviation. You will be restricted to the outer walls, of course. The interior is no place for a civilian, answered Warden Croft. His tone was final, a sharp closing of a door. As we departed, with the great iron gate groaning shut behind us, Holmes fell silent. We walked for some time, the sound of our boots crunching on the dusty track the only interruption to the ever-present hum of the island. The sun began its rapid descent, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, and casting the great jail into a silhouette of profound and menacing darkness. A man who tolerates no deviation, Watson. Such rigidity is a fragile thing. A structure with forgotten sections and sealed-off wings is not a fortress. It is a house filled with secrets. Sherlock Holmes noted. His voice was low, almost a whisper against the rising chorus of the nocturnal insects. I felt a familiar chill, a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the feeling that, despite our quest for orchids, we stood upon the threshold of some dark and intricate problem. The oppressive stillness of the Andaman dawn, a thick blanket of heat and humidity that promised another sweltering day, was shattered not by the rising sun, but by the frantic, jarring clang of the prison's great iron bell. It was not the measured toll for a change of guard, but a wild, panicked peal that spoke of emergency. From our modest quarters I saw lanterns scything through the gloom, and heavy boots thudded and echoed across the stone courtyards. It would appear, my dear Watson, that our botanical respite is to be short-lived, Sherlock Holmes responded. Holmes was already dressed, his gaze fixed upon the central administrative block with an intensity that belied his outwardly casual posture. The naturalist, Sigerson, was gone, and in his place stood the familiar hawk-like figure I knew so well. We joined the stream of guards hurrying towards the governor's private wing, a formidable stone structure attached to the main prison, but enjoying a semblance of isolation. There, before a heavy teak door, we found the source of the commotion. Warden Croft stood at its centre, a man gripped by a cold, trembling fury. His face, usually a mask of rigid discipline, was pale and drawn, his eyes darting about as if expecting an attack from the very shadows. His grip whitened his knuckles on the heavy ring of keys. No response. He is bolted in from the inside, as is his custom. We have been knocking for 10 minutes. The bolt is thrown, the door is locked, and he does not answer, remarked Warden Croft. His voice cracked, a strained, high-pitched sound like a wire stretched to its breaking point. He seemed to be speaking to no one and everyone at once. I recalled the whispers I had heard of the mutiny years ago, of the bloodshed Croft had witnessed, and saw in his frantic demeanour the ghost of that old terror. "And the window, Warden?" Sherlock Holmes noted. Holmes's question, delivered in the calm, inquisitive tone of his naturalist persona, cut through the warden's agitation. Croft shot him a venomous look. Barred and latched from within. There is no way in or out. Force the door, said Warden Croft. At his sharp command, 2 burly guards set their shoulders to the task. A great groaning of wood and metal filled the air, culminating in a sharp crack as the frame gave way. The door flew open, revealing the governor's quarters. The room was immaculate, the bed neatly made but clearly unslept in. A carafe of water stood on the nightstand, and a book lay open upon a reading chair. Of Governor Crewe, however, there was not a trace. The room was utterly, impossibly, and bafflingly empty. "He's gone," answered prison guards. The guard's exclamation was a breath of pure astonishment. Warden Croft stared into the vacant room, his face a canvas of disbelief hardening into a terrible, misguided certainty. His private fear of an internal plot seemed to curdle into a public declaration of a different enemy. "This is not the work of convicts. No prisoner could achieve this. It is the natives, the Andamanese. They have used their jungle witchcraft to spirit him away. Sound the alarm to the coastal patrols. Search the perimeter," responded Warden Croft. His orders were a desperate attempt to impose a familiar narrative upon an impossible reality, diverting all attention from the prison's iron heart to the jungles beyond. While the guards scrambled to obey, Holmes stepped calmly to the threshold, his eyes missing nothing. He did not look for the missing man, but rather at the details of his cage. "A fascinating problem, Warden. A man vanishes from a sealed box. One might almost call it a magic trick," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Croft, brought up short by the quiet, analytical tone, turned on Holmes. For a moment I thought he would have us thrown out, but a flicker of desperation crossed his features. He was a man drowning, and even a piece of driftwood was worth grasping. You have a reputation for observation, Mr. Sigerson. Look then, see for yourself the impossibility of it. See the work of savages, and tell me I am wrong." Warden Croft replied. "It was not a request, but a challenge. A challenge I knew my friend was already preparing to answer as he stepped across the splintered threshold into the silent, empty room. The air in Governor Crewe's quarters was thick and still, heavy with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the cloying perfume of frangipani drifting through the open window. A heavy iron door, now standing ajar, had led us here, its clang echoing behind us like a final judgment. Warden Croft stood with his back to us, a bull of a man silhouetted against the harsh morning light that streamed through the barred opening. Warden Croft stood with his back to us, a bull of a man silhouetted against the harsh morning light that streamed through the barred opening. "See for yourself, Mr. Sigerson. Bolted from the inside, window latched, and yet gone," remarked Warden Croft. His voice was a low growl, but it failed to conceal a tremor of profound anxiety. He gestured vaguely about the disordered room, at an overturned chair and scattered papers. These were the obvious signs of a struggle, the very details upon which his own guards were already fixated. "It is the work of savages, I tell you. They have ways, unnatural ways. They slip through walls like shadows," answered Warden Croft. Holmes, however, paid the man's theory no mind. His eyes, sharp and restless, swept the room not for what was present, but for what was amiss. He moved with the silent grace of a hunting cat, his gaze alighting upon the smallest of details. All the while, Warden Croft paced impatiently, his boots scuffing noisily on the stone floor. "Curious," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He murmured the word so softly it was almost lost. He had knelt, not by the overturned desk as the others had, but by the window-sill, pointing a long, thin finger. There, caught on a splinter of the wooden frame, was a single feather. It was no dull plume from a common jungle fowl. Rather, it was a sliver of impossible blue, shot through with iridescent green, a jewel of a thing utterly alien to this grim fortress. "A trinket," remarked Warden Croft. The Croft dismissed it with a contemptuous wave of his hand. "The natives adorn themselves with such nonsense. It proves my point. They were here." "Does it indeed? Then perhaps you can also explain this, Warden," replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes spoke with a mildness that only seemed to sharpen the warden's temper. He directed our attention to the floor beneath the window. There, upon the polished teak boards, was a series of muddy footprints, the red earth of the island stark against the dark wood. But here was the central, chilling impossibility. The prints led from the window into the room. But, crucially, there were no prints leading back, none whatsoever. A man had apparently walked in, but had never walked out. A man enters through the window, walks into the room, and then vanishes into thin air? A remarkable feat of acrobatics. Or perhaps not a feat of walking at all, Sherlock Holmes said. He fixed his keen grey eyes upon the warden. "Observe, the soil between the prints is entirely undisturbed. A walking man, no matter how careful, would have left some scuff, some slight disruption. These were not made by a man walking. They were placed carefully, one by one, as if lowered from above to create a most misleading trail," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Croft's face darkened, his patience clearly exhausted by what he considered mere parlour games. "Placed? Tribal witchcraft? I have no time for this, sir. My men have found a trail leading into the jungle. That is where we will find our man, and that is where we will deliver justice. I will not have another mutiny born of inaction," remarked Warden Croft. He turned on his heel, his heavy boots striking the floor with resolute finality, and stormed from the room. The sound of his shouts to his guards, ordering a party to be assembled, echoed down the stone corridor. Holmes remained kneeling, his gaze fixed on the impossible footprints, a glint of something far from disappointment in his eyes. It was the unmistakable thrill of the hunt. Warden Croft swept the feather from the table, a gesture of pure contempt. The delicate specimen, a vibrant clue in a world of drab khaki and grey stone, fluttered to the floor and was forgotten. The man's face, a mask of thunder, fixed his eyes not upon the impossible puzzle within the room, but on the menacing green wall of the jungle that pressed in on all sides of the compound. His voice, raw with a fury that had simmered for years, boomed across his sparse office. "Tribal superstition, witch-doctor nonsense! They mock me, thinking me soft. They will learn otherwise," remarked Warden Croft. He strode to the door and flung it open. Oppressive, humid air rushed in, thick with the scent of decay and unseen blossoms. Below, in the main compound, guards mustered. The clatter of rifles and sharp calls of sergeants cut through the morning's heavy stillness. "Sergeant, take every available man. I want a full sweep of the North Jungle, from here to the coast. I want every tribal hut overturned and every path scoured. This insolence will be met with iron. Is that understood?" remarked Warden Croft. From the yard below, a sergeant's voice barked a sharp, "Aye, sir." Within minutes, a column of men marched out through the main gate, their purpose grim and their direction, I felt certain, entirely misguided. The sounds of their progress, the crashing through undergrowth, the occasional distant shout, soon faded, swallowed by the immense, indifferent jungle. A profound silence descended upon the prison, broken only by the lazy buzz of a fly against the window pane. "Holmes," I began, my voice low in the sudden quiet. "He completely ignored the footprints. He cast aside the evidence as if it were meaningless." "Is the man blind?" wondered Dr. John Watson. My friend moved to the window, watching the last of the guards disappear into the verdant chaos. He spoke without turning, his profile a sharp silhouette against the glaring light. "Not blind, Watson. Far worse. He is a man haunted by a ghost of his own making. You see, this entire performance, this brutal, misdirected show of force, is not for our benefit, nor even for the governor's. It is to appease his own past failure," replied Sherlock Holmes. He finally turned from the window, his grey eyes alight with the cold fire of analysis, and picked up a pen from the warden's desk, tapping it thoughtfully against his knuckles. Warden Croft once faced a mutiny from within these very walls. He trusted his prisoners, his guards, and was betrayed. His leniency, as he sees it, cost lives. Now, his mind is pathologically incapable of entertaining the notion of another internal threat. To do so would be to admit the same vulnerability. Therefore, the culprit must be external. His logic is not flawed, Watson. It is crippled by trauma. It makes him rigid and, most importantly, predictable, deduced Sherlock Holmes. "So this manhunt," responded Dr. John Watson, "is a gift," he finished, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It has drawn away the watchdogs and left the hen-house entirely at our disposal. The answer to this vanishing is not in the jungle, it is here," explained Sherlock Holmes. A faint smile touched his lips. He placed the pen back on the desk with deliberate care, then gestured towards the door leading deeper into the prison. "Come, Watson. The warden's wrath has afforded us the one thing we require, time. I have a sudden and profound interest in the unique species of moss that grow upon the inner courtyard walls. Let us see what other forms of life thrive in their shadow." While Warden Croft's men crashed through the jungle on a clamorous and misdirected chase, an unnatural quiet descended upon the prison itself. The sounds of the manhunt, distant shouts, and the crack of trampled undergrowth reached us only as a faint, intermittent rumour carried on the humid air. This sudden lack of oversight granted my friend the precise freedom he required. To any casual observer, the naturalist Sigerson was merely a harmless eccentric, kneeling by the damp lower courses of the stockade wall, his magnifying glass pressed to the stone with an air of profound botanical interest. His voice was a low murmur, barely disturbing the oppressive stillness. "The mosses here are quite extraordinary, my dear fellow. They tell a story of neglect and damp, a perfect medium for observation," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I knew better, of course. His eyes, sharp and restless, were not fixed upon the miniature flora. They were scanning the exercise yard, a desolate quadrangle of packed earth where the prisoners shuffled in listless circles under the unforgiving sun. They were a defeated congregation, a grey tide of bowed heads and shuffling forms. Yet, as I followed Holmes's gaze, I began to perceive what he did, that this was no mere rabble. There was a current beneath the surface, a hidden order. His attention, and soon mine, settled upon one man in particular. He was not physically imposing, yet he possessed a quiet dignity that set him apart as surely as if he had worn a crown. While others slouched, he stood erect. While their eyes were vacant, his were watchful and intelligent. The other men afforded him a subtle deference. Paths cleared fractionally as he approached. Questions were met with a respectful dip of the head. I later learned his name was Anand Chatterjee, a political prisoner sent from Calcutta, an engineer by trade. "Do you see it, Watson?" he asked, not looking at me, his lens still fixed upon a patch of lichen. The man who just passed the water pump coughed twice. A moment later, the prisoner mending the net by the far wall dropped his shuttle. It is not a coincidence. "A signal, you mean?" I whispered, taken aback. Dr. John Watson said, "More than that. It is a language, a silent, disciplined network of communication operating under the very noses of their jailers. Such a system does not arise spontaneously. It requires a formidable intellect to conceive and an unshakable will to enforce. It requires a general." His gaze flickered meaningfully towards the composed figure of Chatterjee before returning to the wall. "Croft hunts tigers in the jungle when the true predator is right here in his cage," stated Sherlock Holmes. The midday bell soon rang out, its harsh clangor sending the prisoners shuffling back towards their cell blocks. We followed at a distance, the heavy air of the yard giving way to the cool, echoing stone of the prison corridors. The rhythmic scrape of 100 pairs of boots on the flagstones was the only sound. As we passed a narrow, barred window set high in the wall for ventilation, Holmes came to an abrupt halt, his body going rigid, his gaze narrowing upon a single point on the floor. There, lying in the grime and dust, was a small, dark object, utterly incongruous in this place of stone and iron, that had clearly drifted down from the grate above. With a swift, almost furtive movement, Holmes stooped and plucked it from the floor. He held it in his palm for a moment, a single, perfectly formed grey feather, its tip barred with a startling white. A flicker of pure triumph ignited in his eyes as he carefully folded it into a specimen envelope from his pocket, a silent promise of a new and most revealing line of inquiry. The oppressive heat of our temporary quarters did little to dampen the fierce energy that now animated my friend. Since our brief tour of the prison yard, Holmes had abandoned all pretense of botanical study, his collection of orchids lying quite forgotten. Instead, his entire attention was consumed by the single, unassuming grey feather. The drone of insects outside was a constant, monotonous hum. Inside the room, the profound silence seemed magnified as Holmes hunched over his travelling microscope. "Come here, Watson. Your medical eye will appreciate the exquisite architecture of this specimen," explained Sherlock Holmes. His voice was low, resonant with a restrained excitement I knew all too well. I moved to his side, the floorboards groaning softly under my weight. He adjusted the brass focus knob with a delicate touch. Through the eyepiece, the feather was transformed. It was no longer a simple thing. It was a complex marvel of interlocking barbs and barbules, a structure of profound strength and lightness. The soft clink of a glass slide being moved was the only sound for a full minute. "It is remarkable, certainly, but it remains a feather. Warden Croft believes it came from some native bird, perhaps disturbed during the natives' supposed assault." Dr. John Watson inquired. "Warden Croft, my dear fellow, is a man who sees only what his past traumas permit him to see. He looks for savages in the jungle, and so he finds them. But this feather does not speak of the jungle. It speaks of Calcutta. It speaks of Delhi," explained Sherlock Holmes. He straightened up, his grey eyes alight with the fire of discovery. He tapped a long, thin finger on a chart of avian illustrations he had spread across the table. "This is a primary, covert feather from the wing of a blue-barred Shirazi, a breed of domestic pigeon, Watson, famed for its strength and homing instinct. They are bred on the mainland as racing and carrier birds. There is not a single one of its kind, nor anything remotely like it, to be found wild upon these islands. Its presence here is as impossible as finding a polar bear in the Sahara," Sherlock Holmes said. The finality in his tone sent a chill through me, despite the sweltering air. The implications were staggering, dismantling the entire official theory with one fell swoop. This was not a random act of violence. It was something else entirely. "Good heavens, Holmes, then the bird must have been brought here," commented Dr. John Watson. "Precisely. And consider the logistics. A prisoner cannot simply wander in with a pigeon in his pocket. It would have been discovered in an instant. Such a creature could only be introduced to this facility by someone not subject to the rigorous daily searches, someone who moves about with a degree of freedom. A guard, Watson, or another member of the staff. Our vanishing is not the work of an outsider, nor of a lone prisoner. It is a conspiracy with accomplices both inside and out," Sherlock Holmes responded. He began to pace the small room, the rhythmic tap of his heels on the wood a stark counterpoint to the jungle's ceaseless hum. The case had transformed. What had seemed a crude act of barbarism was now revealed as a plot of profound sophistication. It was an act that required meticulous planning and communication with the outside world. The governor was not merely removed. A message was sent. The entire affair was a vessel for communication. This revelation changes everything. It means the conspirators, for all their brilliance, left not one clue, but two. Sherlock Holmes noted. He came to a sudden halt. With a decisive movement, he swept the feather and his lens to one side. His gaze fell upon a small tin box on the corner of the table, a container I recognized from his sample-collecting kit. He picked it up, his expression hardening into one of intense, predatory focus. I knew what it contained. The dark, damp earth he had scraped from the edge of that single, incriminating footprint. The revelation of the carrier pigeon hung in the oppressive air of the late governor's study, a puzzle piece that changed the entire shape of the board. Holmes, however, did not linger upon it. He moved with that singular focus I knew so well, turning from the desk to a small tin box he had placed upon the mantelpiece. The scrape of the metal lid was the only sound in the room. "The feather told us of a message sent," Sigerson remarked, his voice returning to the clipped tones of the naturalist he purported to be. "Now let us see what the earth has to say of the messenger," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He produced from the tin a dry, crumbling flake of reddish-brown mud, which he had meticulously scraped from the edge of that peculiar footprint beneath the window the day before. He placed it carefully upon a sheet of clean writing paper, a stark contrast of earthy red against the pristine white. His next request was for a trowel and access to the grounds, a simple appeal that was met with a surprising degree of suspicion. A sullen guard, a man with a heavy jaw and distrustful eyes, was assigned to escort us, his boots crunching heavily on the gravel path as he led the way. We were brought not to the jungle's edge, but to a large, immaculately tended vegetable garden that sat incongruously within the prison walls. The sun beat down upon us, and the air was thick with the scent of damp soil and wilted greens. The distant rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from a workshop, a grim counterpoint to the drone of insects. Holmes paid the guard no mind, kneeling at once beside a row of cabbages. "The warden wants no interference with the grounds, sir. He was most particular," answered prison guard. His reply came without him so much as turning his head. A simple comparative analysis of the local loam, purely for my monograph on the island's flora. "I shall be but a moment," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He plunged the trowel into the dark, rich earth between the plants and placed a generous sample into a second tin. Then, to my surprise, he directed our reluctant escort to the very edge of the jungle that pressed against the prison's outer wall. There, the ground was of an entirely different character, a hard, reddish clay. He collected a third sample before finally nodding, satisfied. The guard watched his every move, his expression a mixture of confusion and open hostility. Back in the privacy of our quarters, Holmes meticulously arranged his findings upon the writing paper. To the left, the reddish flake from the footprint. In the centre, the dark, almost black soil from the vegetable patch, and to the right, the ruddy clay from the jungle's verge. Now, Watson, your senses are as keen as any man's. Take a pinch of the clay from the jungle's verge. Tell me of its character, stated Sherlock Holmes. I did as he asked. The clay was gritty and coarse between my fingers, resisting pressure. It feels nothing like the sample from the footprint. That one is a fine powder by comparison, remarked Dr. John Watson. Precisely. It does not match the jungle soil because it did not come from the jungle. Now try the sample from the vegetable patch, observed Sherlock Holmes. The conclusion, once presented, was as immediate as it was startling to my mind. Barring a slight difference in dryness, the soil from the footprint and the soil from the prison's own garden were identical. The same dark color, the same fine, loamy texture, undeniable to even my less acute observation. The footprints were a fabrication, my friend, a deliberate and carefully staged piece of theatre. Someone walked through that vegetable patch, coated their boots in its distinct soil, and then meticulously pressed those prints into the ground beneath the governor's window. It was all designed to draw every eye outward, to the jungle, to the natives, to anywhere but within these walls. He stood and began to pace the small room, the floorboards creaking under his feet. The pieces were now assembling themselves with a terrible and fascinating logic. So, we have it, a means of external communication in the form of a pigeon, an elaborate misdirection in the form of the footprints, proving the culprit is intimately familiar with the prison. It was an inside job, designed to look like an outside attack. And yet, no lock was forced, no bars were sawn, no alarm was raised. The man vanished from a sealed room. They did not drag him out, Watson. They could not have. Sherlock Holmes responded. He stopped pacing and stared at the ceiling, a strange new light dawning in his eyes. A thought so audacious, so brilliantly simple, was forming behind that great brow. He fell silent, leaving me to ponder the impossible contradiction he had just laid bare. The oppressive heat of our temporary quarters had done little to dampen Holmes's spirits. On the contrary, since his discovery concerning the fraudulent soil, he had been possessed by a feverish energy that defied the climate. He paced the length of the rattan-matted floor, a lean tiger in a cage of his own making, while outside the window the ceaseless drone of insects formed a monotonous backdrop to his thoughts. Papers and crude diagrams of the prison layout lay scattered across the table, disturbed by the occasional gust from the lethargic ceiling fan. He stopped his patrol so abruptly that I looked up from my journal. His voice was sharp, cutting through the humid air. "It is a masterpiece of misdirection, Watson, a veritable symphony of deception," observed Sherlock Holmes. "The footprints, you mean?" I asked. Dr. John Watson said. "Precisely. They were not a clue, but an anchor, designed to weigh down the investigation, to fix Warden Croft's gaze firmly upon the jungle and the native tribes he so fears. By proving the mud came from within the prison garden, we have not merely dismissed a false trail, we have established a foundational truth." He seized a charcoal stick, and with a single decisive stroke drew a stark circle upon a fresh sheet of paper. The harsh scratching of charcoal on parchment was the only sound in the quiet room. "This prison is our circle," he declared, his finger tapping the center. "The crime was committed here. The perpetrator is here. Every instinct of Croft's is to look outside the circle, but the evidence screams that the solution lies within." He resumed his restless pacing, ticking points off on his fingers as he spoke. "Consider the facts as they now stand. 1. An inside job. 2. A deliberate and clever attempt to feign an outside attack. 3. A carrier pigeon, which indicates a need to communicate outwards, but not necessarily to facilitate an escape. And 4, the most stubborn fact of all, an impossible exit. The room was sealed from within. The bars are intact. The guards saw nothing. The governor, Watson, simply vanished from a locked box. He fell silent, and for a long moment the only sound was the distant, mournful clang of a bell marking the change of the guard. Holmes strode to the window, which overlooked the grim geometry of the prison compound. He stared intently at the governor's block, a squat, formidable building baking under the relentless sun. "But if there was no exit, Holmes, then how?" Dr. John Watson commented. His reply came in a low, reverent tone, his eyes still fixed on the building. "Because we have been laboring under a false premise. We have searched for a conventional exit, a door, a window, a tunnel. When you have eliminated all the logical routes, you must consider the illogical. The governor was not taken out, my dear fellow. He turned from the window, and his grey eyes shone with a triumphant light. He was taken up," deduced Sherlock Holmes. "I confess, the notion was so audacious, so utterly fantastic, that I could only stare at him speechless. Hoisted upwards from a sealed room, it was the stuff of penny dreadfuls. Up, I finally managed to repeat, my voice betraying my incredulity. To the roof, remarked Dr. John Watson. Or through it, he corrected softly. It is an act of sublime engineering, requiring immense precision and an intimate knowledge of the building's structure. And there is only one place from which such an operation could be staged." He gestured back towards the prison view. "The cells directly above the governor's quarters. Our investigation has, until now, been entirely horizontal." "It is time, Watson, that we looked to the heavens," replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's remarkable theory sharpened and defined our purpose. We were no longer searching for a hidden exit, but for an anchor point. Under the guise of his naturalist persona, Mr. Sigerson expressed a profound, if eccentric, interest in the prison stonework. Warden Croft, eager to be rid of us, grudgingly accepted this pretext. Thus we found ourselves ascending a narrow stone staircase, our footsteps echoing flatly in the oppressive, humid air of the upper cell block. The rhythmic clang of a hammer from some distant workshop was the only sound that punctuated the suffocating silence. The cell we sought was occupied. Its inhabitant, a man named Anand Chatterjee, stood as we entered. He was of slight build, with the fine features of a scholar, yet his eyes held a placid and unnerving intelligence. He gave a slight bow, his face a mask of polite neutrality. Holmes began his peculiar inspection, leaving me to stand awkwardly by the door. Holmes ignored the prisoner entirely at first. His attention was fixed upon the cell's architecture. He moved with the quiet intensity of a hunting cat, his gaze sweeping from the floor to the ceiling. He paced the small dimensions twice, then stopped beneath the barred window that overlooked the sheer drop to the governor's courtyard below. He ran a long, thin finger along an iron bar, his touch as delicate as a surgeon's. His voice was low, yet it carried with perfect clarity in the small space. "Watson, come here. Lend me your eyes," deduced Sherlock Holmes. I moved to his side. To my eye, the iron bar was indistinguishable from its fellows, pitted and coarse. Yet Holmes pointed to a spot near its base, where it was set into the stone sill. "Do you not see it? a faint, almost imperceptible scoring of the metal, and look above, on the ceiling stone directly over this point. Another set of abrasions, newer than the stone's original dressing. What does that suggest to you?" I confessed that it suggested very little. Holmes gave a sigh of restrained impatience. Then, with a curious intensity, he raised his head and sniffed the air, his nostrils twitching, his eyes closing for a moment as he concentrated. "There is a scent here, faint but distinct, beneath the general miasma of the prison. It is not the mineral odour of machine oil, nor is it common lamp oil. This, my dear fellow, is the smell of rendered animal fat, an improvised lubricant for a mechanism that had to operate in near silence," declared Sherlock Holmes. He straightened up, his eyes now gleaming with the cold fire of absolute certainty. He gestured from the bar to the ceiling, connecting the 2 points with an invisible line. "The evidence is as plain as a pikestaff. A rope or wire, lubricated to prevent it from grating, was passed over this stone and anchored to this very bar. This cell, Watson, was not merely a cell. It was the winch room. It was the pivot for the entire operation." Throughout this remarkable pronouncement, Anand Chatterjee had not moved a muscle. He simply watched my friend, his expression unreadable. Now Holmes turned to him, his tone shifting from that of a detective to one of academic curiosity. "A man of great precision, I see, Mr. Chatterjee. A mind that abhors chaos and values order above all else," Sherlock Holmes responded. The prisoner's reply came without a moment's hesitation, his voice calm and even, betraying nothing. "In such a small space, sir, order is a necessity, not a virtue," Anand Chatterjee answered. Holmes held his gaze for a long moment, a silent duel of intellects, before turning to leave. As the heavy cell door grated shut behind us, its bolt echoing down the corridor, Holmes spoke again, his voice a thoughtful murmur. "That man, Watson, possesses a mind of the first order. It is not with brute force that we shall uncover this truth, but by engaging the architect on his own intellectual ground. I fancy a discussion is in order, a purely theoretical one, of course, on the subject of engineering under extreme constraints," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The air in Anand Chatterjee's cell was still and heavy, scented with damp stone and something faintly metallic, like old tools. A single high window cast a pale rectangle of light upon the floor, illuminating the man on a simple stool. He was slender, with the quiet composure of a scholar, and watched our entrance with dark, intelligent eyes that held neither fear nor surprise. The iron door closed behind us with a dreadful finality, its echoes swallowed by the thick walls, leaving us in a profound and watchful silence. Holmes, still maintaining his guise as the naturalist Sigerson, gestured not to the clues he had discovered, but to a small, intricately carved wooden bird resting on a shelf. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Holmes spoke, his voice one of academic curiosity, entirely devoid of accusation. "A fascinating piece of work, Mr. Chatterjee. It displays a remarkable understanding of balance and stress. One might almost say an engineer's touch," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The prisoner inclined his head slightly. His voice was soft but clear, with a precise and educated cadence. "One finds ways to occupy the mind, sir. The hands follow." Anand Chatterjee replied. Holmes paced the short length of the cell once, his footsteps soft on the stone. He stopped and turned, his expression one of pure intellectual inquiry. Indeed, it has led me to consider a curious problem, one I thought might appeal to a mind such as yours. It is a matter of practical physics, a theoretical puzzle, you understand, Sherlock Holmes noted. I am at your disposal, Mr. Sigerson. A good puzzle is a rare commodity here, responded Anand Chatterjee. I could feel the tension in the small space, a current of unspoken meaning flowing between the two men. It was a duel of intellects played out under the thinnest veneer of casual conversation. Holmes began, his voice dropping slightly. Imagine a sealed room directly below this one. In that room, an object of considerable weight, let us say a man, must be removed. Not through the door, nor the window, but upwards, through the ceiling. How would an engineer approach such a task, given only the materials one might find in a place like this, and the absolute necessity of silence? Sherlock Holmes noted. Chatterjee did not hesitate. His gaze became distant, not looking at Holmes, but at the problem itself. He was no longer a prisoner, but an engineer in his workshop. His reply was measured, almost a lecture. Silence would be the principal challenge. Direct force is loud. Therefore, one would require a counterweight system, a slow, steady lift, rather than a jarring pull. The fulcrum would be the key. It must be anchored to the most secure point available, answered Anand Chatterjee. As he spoke, his eyes flickered for the briefest of moments towards the thick iron bar of his own cell window, the very bar upon which Holmes had found the incriminating abrasions. Holmes pressed, his tone still light. And the rope? It would need to be immensely strong, yet pliable, Sherlock Holmes noted. One would not use a single rope. Too much friction, too much risk of sound and fraying. No, you would braid it. Strips of bedding, of uniform, tightly woven, and perhaps even oiled to reduce the noise of its passage against stone, answered Anand Chatterjee. His words hung in the air, a perfect, unwitting confession that aligned precisely with every deduction Holmes had made. The lingering scent of oil in the cell, now suddenly pungent, became a damning confirmation. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, the naturalist's amiable mask dissolving to reveal the keen, hawk-like features of the detective beneath. The intellectual game was over. He spoke at last, his voice low and sharp, stripped of all pretense. "A brilliant solution, Mr. Chatterjee, quite brilliant," deduced Sherlock Holmes. There was no triumph in his tone, only a quiet, profound respect for the mind of his adversary. The unspoken truth settled between them, as solid and inescapable as the stone walls that enclosed us. Though I was not present for the final, crucial interview, Holmes recounted it to me that very evening in such vivid detail that I feel as though I had been a fly upon the damp stone wall of that cell. After our theoretical discourse, he had dismissed me, wishing to speak with the prisoner alone. The heavy iron door had boomed shut, leaving Holmes and the engineer, Anand Chatterjee, in the stark quiet of the small chamber, broken only by the distant rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel from the prison smithy. Holmes told me he let the silence stretch, observing the man before him. Chatterjee sat upon his stool, hands resting calmly in his lap, his expression unreadable. It was Holmes who finally broke the spell, his voice low and devoid of all pretense. "Let us dispense with the charade of orchids and engineers, Mr. Chatterjee. The theoretical problem is solved. My name is Sherlock Holmes," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A flicker of something, not surprise, but confirmation, passed across the prisoner's features. A slow, faint smile touched his lips. He spoke softly, his voice a calm counterpoint to the harsh echoes of the prison. "I had suspected as much. The questions were too precise for a mere naturalist. Your reputation precedes you, even to a place such as this," Anand Chatterjee said. "As your ingenuity precedes you," Holmes returned sharply. "Your misdirection was masterful. The pigeon feather on the governor's sill, for instance. Too clean for a wild bird of these cliffs. It came, I presume, from a domestic carrier, brought in by a sympathetic guard and planted by your own hand to suggest an outside agent," Sherlock Holmes responded. Then there were the slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes fixed on Holmes's face, acknowledging the point as one academic might to another. "Then there were the footprints," Holmes continued, pacing the 3 short steps the cell allowed. "A clever ruse to send Warden Croft and his men scrambling through the jungle. A single boot affixed to a pole and lowered from this very window, pressed into the soft earth to create a false trail leading away from the true scene of the crime." Holmes stopped and pointed a long finger towards the window bars. But the masterpiece was the vanishing itself. Faint abrasions on the governor's bars, and even fainter ones here, tell a tale of a rope and a pulley system. A rope braided, I would wager, over many months from the threads of discarded uniforms. The grappling hook forged with infinite patience from the iron of a bed frame in the prison workshop. "Am I correct?" replied Sherlock Holmes. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent of guilt, but a calm, measured statement of fact. Chatterjee seemed not to be admitting to a crime, but rather taking pride in the solution to a complex problem, his voice holding a note of profound respect. "You are not merely correct, Mr. Holmes. You are magnificent. Every detail. The rope took nearly a year to braid, a few threads at a time. The hook was heated over a smuggled candle and bent with a loose stone from the floor. The governor was rendered unconscious with a draught in his nightly wine, and I hoisted his dead weight across the chasm to a waiting boat. It was merely an application of leverage and patience." Holmes stood motionless, absorbing the sheer, bloody-minded brilliance of the scheme. He had found his mastermind. Yet one crucial piece remained out of place. "A brilliant execution," he conceded, his tone now one of pure intellectual curiosity. "But it begs the ultimate question. For all this effort, for this display of genius, you remain here. You orchestrated an impossible escape, but not for yourself. Why?" declared Sherlock Holmes. At this, Chatterjee's calm demeanour finally cracked. The academic pride in his eyes was replaced by a cold, hard fire. He rose slowly from his stool, the scrape of its legs on the stone floor sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. His voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it carried more weight than any shout. "Escape was never the goal, Mr. Holmes. Justice was," remarked Anand Chatterjee. Much later, in the oppressive heat of our small quarters, Holmes recounted his singular interview with Anand Chatterjee. His tone was low and measured, his face cast in shadow by the flickering oil lamp. I felt as though I were in that damp cell with him, a silent witness to the unravelling of a plot far deeper than we had ever imagined.
"A masterful deception," I told him, my voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "The feather was a flourish worthy of a stage magician, but it does not answer the fundamental question. Why? A man of your intellect does not orchestrate such a theatre merely for the sake of escape," declared Sherlock Holmes.
Holmes described how the prisoner's weary expression shifted, replaced by a burning intensity. For the first time, the engineer's quiet dignity gave way to the passion of the revolutionary. Escape? His voice was a soft, bitter whisper. To what? Another British colony? No, Mr. Sigerson, this was never about my freedom. It was about justice, the sort of justice that cannot be found in a courtroom presided over by the very men who perpetuate the crime. Anand Chatterjee answered. Without another word, Chatterjee knelt. His fingers found purchase on the edge of a floor stone near the wall, a stone I had examined myself and found unremarkable. With a low, grating sound that sent a shiver through the silence, he lifted it, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. From this cavity he withdrew a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. "I confess, my examination of your cell floor was evidently less than thorough," declared Sherlock Holmes. "It would have been of no use," he replied, his hands carefully unwrapping the package. "The stone is weighted precisely. You were looking for a mechanism. This, Mr. Sigerson, is merely a cavity," answered Anand Chatterjee. He produced a slim leather-bound ledger. He held it out not as a clue, but as an indictment. Its pages were filled with a cramped, precise script detailing dates, names, and figures. "This is Governor Crewe's private ledger, not of official accounts, but of his private cruelties. Starved rations sold for profit, medical supplies withheld to break a man's spirit, sentences extended on false pretenses. It is all here. Proof. This book was the true prisoner, Mr. Sigerson, and I have engineered its escape." Anand Chatterjee answered. "Holmes told me he stood perfectly still, the enormity of the confession descending upon him. The crime was not a vanishing, it was a rescue." "And the governor? He is not in some secret compartment of your own design, is he?" declared Sherlock Holmes. A faint smile touched his lips. "No, that would be too complex. He is merely misplaced. This prison is over a century old, built in stages. There are forgotten spaces between the new walls and the old, what the original plans call construction voids. I found them referenced in an old survey. The governor is quite safe in one, with water and hardtack. He is not the victim here. He is the evidence," replied Anand Chatterjee. The catergery placed the ledger on the small cot, a stark and damning exhibit in the centre of the cell. His gaze met Holmes's, and his voice was steady, devoid of hope or fear, presenting only a fact. "The pigeon that carries my message to Calcutta will be followed by another, carrying this ledger to a journalist I trust. All I needed was time, and a diversion grand enough to prevent a thorough search of the prison itself.
Now you know everything. The law would demand you hand me over to Warden Croft, and this book would be burned. But I ask you, Mr. Sigerson, what does justice demand?" Anand Chatterjee answered. As Holmes finished his account, he fell silent. He stared into the flickering lamp, but I knew he was seeing that cell, that ledger, and the terrible, brilliant man who had placed the scales of justice directly into his hands. The distant cry of a night bird was the only sound that broke the profound stillness. We returned to our quarters in a silence more profound than any I had known. The heavy, humid air of the Andamans, usually alive with the ceaseless chirr of insects and the distant sigh of the surf, seemed to press in upon us, amplifying the gravity of Chatterjee's confession. The single oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows across the room, making a phantom of my friend as he stood, unmoving, before the screened window. He did not pace, nor did he light his pipe. For a full quarter of an hour he remained a rigid silhouette against the deep indigo of the tropical night. I knew that within that stillness a tempest of logic and morality was raging. The facts of the case, once a complex intellectual puzzle, had coalesced into a moral quandary of the most formidable nature. I dared not interrupt his thoughts. At last he turned, though his eyes did not seem to see me. They were fixed upon some distant point of principle, a place where law and justice diverge. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, devoid of its usual sharp confidence. The law, Watson, is an edifice built of rigid stones. A man has been deprived of his liberty. A crime has been committed. By the letter of that law, Mr. Chatterjee is a felon, and we are bound to deliver him, Sherlock Holmes said. He paused, letting the stark declaration hang in the humid air between us. He picked up a small, intricately patterned seashell from his collection table, turning it over and over under the lamplight. "And yet," he continued, his tone hardening slightly, "we hold in our knowledge a second ledger, not of accounts, but of atrocities. A document that proves the so-called victim to be a monster, a tyrant whose cruelty is sanctioned by the very system we are sworn to uphold. To deliver Chatterjee is to condemn this evidence and all the souls it represents to oblivion." Here was the crux of it. The brilliant mind of the engineer, a man who could devise such an elegant and audacious plan, not for escape, but for justice, weighed against the corrupt heart of a governor who hid behind a veneer of authority. It was a scale upon which the fate of more than one man rested. To sacrifice such an intellect for the sake of preserving a corrupt official, it is an equation that does not balance. The law in this instance is blind, Watson. It sees the cage, but not the tiger, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A sudden decisiveness entered his bearing. He set the shell down with a soft click, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The period of reflection was over. The time for action, at last, was at hand. He looked at me directly then, and the familiar keen spark had returned to his eyes. His voice was crisp now, the voice of a man who has chosen his path. Warden Croft requires an explanation for a vanishing. He is a man who sees shadows and imagines native conspiracies. He shall have a report that satisfies the mechanics of the crime, but attributes it to a phantom of our own making.
I understood at once. He would not expose Chatterjee. He would, in fact, aid him. A thrill of anticipation, not unmixed with apprehension, ran through me. And as for the ledger, he added, a thin smile touching his lips, justice, like nature, has its own methods of propagation. We are, after all, here under the guise of naturalists. I believe it is time to conclude my study on the island's avifauna. A final report is due, Sherlock Holmes noted. We found Warden Croft in his office, a man besieged not by rebels, but by the oppressive weight of the Andaman heat and his own rigid certainties. A punkah fan stirred the humid air, its slow, rhythmic sigh offering little relief. Papers were stacked on his desk with military precision, yet his eyes, when they met ours, were disordered and restless, the whites shot through with red veins. He gestured us to a pair of stiff-backed chairs, the scrape of their legs gratingly loud against the stone floor. His voice was as dry as old parchment. "You have concluded your inquiries, Mr. Sigerson," Warden Croft said. Holmes, in his guise as the placid naturalist, inclined his head. "I have, Warden, and the matter, I believe, is far simpler than we had first imagined. It is a classic problem of misdirection," observed Sherlock Holmes. Croft leaned forward, his knuckles white upon the polished, heat-warped wood of the desk. The faint ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece seemed to grow louder in the ensuing silence. He spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Explain," responded Warden Croft. "Governor Crewe did not vanish into thin air. He was removed. The faint abrasions on the exterior window ledge, which you dismissed as weathering, are in fact rope burns. The displaced shingle on the roof above, the single muddy footprint near the hibiscus bush below, all point to the same conclusion. An accomplice, a man of considerable athletic prowess, scaled the wall, secured a rope, and assisted the governor in his descent." A look of profound, almost grim satisfaction settled on the warden's face, the tight line of his mouth relaxing for the first time. This was the theory he had clung to from the start, a validation of his belief that the prison itself was inviolable. An outside agent, I knew it. Someone from the mainland, no doubt, with a boat waiting. "My constables will scour the coastline," Warden Croft replied. "I fear you will find nothing," Holmes replied, his voice imbued with an air of academic finality. "They have had a full day's head start. By now they are lost to the sea. The governor has not been abducted, Warden. He has fled. The accomplice was merely the key to his self-made cage," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Having delivered this verdict, a masterful tapestry woven from threads of truth and strands of pure invention, Holmes shifted his weight. Beside his chair rested a polished teak box, intricately carved and fitted with brass clasps. It was the sort of container a naturalist might use for transporting delicate specimens. His tone became lighter, shedding the gravity of the investigation. "And now, with my official business concluded, I must attend to a matter of personal principle. During my stay, I have been observing a native hill miner nursing it back from a wing injury. The time has come to return it to the wild. If you and your guards would indulge me," observed Sherlock Holmes. Warden Croft waved a dismissive hand, his mind clearly elsewhere, already drafting reports and dispatching patrols on a futile chase. We proceeded to the main courtyard, the sudden glare of the sun making me squint after the gloom of the office. 2 guards trailed behind us out of habit. Holmes placed the box upon a stone balustrade, its surface warm from the relentless sun. I watched his hands closely. He spoke of the bird's remarkable mimicry, his voice a calm and steady lecture, but my eyes were fixed on his fingers as they moved to the latch. I saw his thumb press a small, almost invisible stud on the side of the box. There was no sound, merely the faintest internal shift, a motion so subtle that had I not been looking for it, I should have missed it entirely. "A creature of the air," he mused, his gaze directed at the sky, drawing the guard's attention with him, longs for nothing more than the freedom of the open sky, stated Sherlock Holmes. With a flick of the main clasp, he threw open the lid. A bird shot out, not the glossy black myna I had half expected, but a slate-grey pigeon. It did not flutter aimlessly. It circled the courtyard once, its wings beating with a powerful and urgent rhythm, a sudden whirring that cut through the courtyard's oppressive silence, before setting a determined course, straight as an arrow, towards the distant haze that marked the Indian mainland. We watched until it was a speck, a tiny messenger carrying a truth far heavier than itself, disappearing into the vast, indifferent blue of the sky and sea. London autumn had settled upon us in earnest. Beyond our windows at 221B Baker Street, the world was a swirling miasma of fog and drizzle. The ceaseless clatter of carriage wheels on the wet cobblestones provided a familiar, comforting rhythm. I had set aside my medical journal, content to watch the flames dance in our hearth. It was then I realized that for nearly an hour Holmes had not moved from his armchair, save to draw upon his pipe. He stared into the fire, his long, thin fingers steepled before him, his mind clearly far from London's damp chill. The silence was broken only by the soft hiss of the gaslight and the crackle of a log in the grate. At last he stirred, and the rustle of the newspaper he had laid aside drew my attention. "Watson, have you by chance seen the Colonial Dispatches in today's Times? Page 4, a minor column near the shipping news," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. His voice was quiet, almost deceptively casual. I confessed I had not, and he extended the paper towards me. His finger tapped a small block of text, an article of no more than a few inches, detailing administrative changes in the Indian territories. "I see it, Holmes. Governor recalled amidst inquiry. It seems a Sir Alistair Crewe has been relieved of his post. Financial irregularities, it says. A common enough tale of colonial mismanagement, I should think," Dr. John Watson said. "Common enough, indeed. And yet, does it not strike you as curious what is omitted from that dry report? There is no mention of a dramatic vanishing, no word of native insurrection, no hint of a man spirited away from a locked room. The entire affair has been scrubbed clean, leaving only a tidy, if sordid, tale of embezzlement," Sherlock Holmes said. "The name, Crewe, struck me with the force of a physical blow. The humid, oppressive air of the Andaman Islands seemed to fill our cosy sitting-room. For a moment I could almost hear the distant cry of a tropical bird. I looked from the paper to my friend. His grey eyes held a glint of profound satisfaction.
Good heavens, Holmes! Then the pigeon, Chatterjee's desperate gamble, it succeeded? Remarked Dr. John Watson.
It flew true, Watson. That small feathered messenger carried a weight of truth far heavier than its own body. The ledger it bore found its way to the right hands in Calcutta. The subsequent investigation, it appears, was most thorough, if discreet. The official story protects the reputation of the Colonial Office, but the result is the same. Justice, in its own fashion, has been served, stated Sherlock Holmes.
I lowered the paper, contemplating the strange conclusion to that most singular of cases. We had stood by and allowed a crime, for kidnapping is surely a crime, to be committed, and by Holmes's own brilliant misdirection had even aided the delivery of its evidence. But the law was broken, Holmes, by Chatterjee and, in a way, by us. Dr. John Watson replied.
The law is a framework, Watson, not a divine mandate. Warden Croft was a man shackled by the letter of it. His rigidity nearly led to further tragedy. In Anand Chatterjee, I saw a man who sought not chaos, but a correction. He engineered an impossible act, not for his own freedom, but to uncage a truth the law itself had imprisoned. Sometimes, my dear fellow, one must look past the intricacies of the lock to see the justice of opening the door, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent, turning his gaze back to the fire. He picked up his violin from its case, but did not play, merely holding it as he watched the embers glow and then fade. In that quiet moment I felt I understood my friend more deeply than ever before. He was not merely a pursuer of criminals, but a connoisseur of justice in all its complex and often contradictory forms. The case of the Port Blair vanishing was closed, not with the clang of a prison gate, but with the silent, triumphant flight of an uncaged bird.